Hello, welcome to the Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Deacon Dick Hudson at St. Louis Catholic Church and your host today. The Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you through the newly founded ecumenical organization, the Austin Metropolitan Ministries, jointly with television station KTBC Channel 7. Our topic today is the Presbyterian faith tradition. Our guests today are Robert M. Shelton, Academic Dean of the Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary; Reverend George Cladis, pastor of the Covenant Presbyterian Church; Helen Locklear, a senior at the Austin Presbyterian Seminary. Welcome. Before we look at the faith tradition at this point in time, let's go back to the early 1790s. A young Presbyterian man from Pennsylvania drifts down the Ohio River, which then funnels into the Mississippi, until he reaches New Orleans. From there he enters what is the territory of Texas and lives among the Indians, repairing their firearms, joining them on their hunting expeditions. This lasted for 14 months until a detachment of Mexican soldiers from Nacogdoches arrested him for it was unlawful for a Protestant to enter Texas. He was imprisoned in San Antonio for 70 days before being expelled from the state by the Mexican governor. His name was John Calvert. 50 years later, the Presbyterian Church began to flourish. Reading from the minutes of the First Presbytery of Texas, it defines its bounds as the territory of the Republic of Texas. At that, the Presbyterian minister at that particular presbytery, the minister, Reverend William Y. Allen, stated that the Presbyterian Church began in the city of Austin on October the 13th, 1839. It was made up of 6 members, 2 ruling elders. 6 additions took place following that initial beginning, and the house of worship commenced. Welcome to our show today. Before we begin, maybe we ought to set the ground as to where we're at today. What does the Presbyterian community look like, Bob, in terms of maybe number of congregation, maybe families?
I think you'd find approximately 15 to 16 congregations, and then maybe 3,000 to 4,000 family units that would represent here in Austin.
And that's quite a growth in that 150 years or so that we're talking about. Very quickly in there, and that represents a blending of a number of expressions of the Presbyterian tradition too.
Yes, among those would be the former United Presbyterian Church, as it was known, and the Presbyterian Church U.S. and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. All 3 of them have common roots but separate, distinctive histories as you move into the 19th century. Okay. Being as that you're the academic dean, maybe we ought to talk just a little bit about the seminary. As I read through some of the early history of the Presbyterian Church in Texas, one of the very first presbyters in this organization, they felt it was important to have education. Seminaries of their own making, paid for by the work, sweat, and tears of the people of Texas. Wouldn't prevent outside help, but they clearly seemed to have a very important understanding and an important role that education, without education, it was difficult for the church to continue. Education has always been critical for Presbyterian tradition. I think some of the debate goes on in that particular time in the 19th century, not only about having education, but where you're going to receive your education.
Okay.
So west of the Red River becomes an issue, whether or not we're going to have a seminary here and train ministers here, or whether you have to go back to Princeton or to Richmond to get a valid education for a minister. Now, with respect to other education, it's not quite so
difficult a situation, because Presbyterians think you have to be involved with education. That's part of your mission. So if you look at the Presbyterian history, wherever they go, they start schools for women students, institutes or academies, they call them. Colleges are started everywhere. In fact, one of the middle judicatories, the Synod, has traditionally been the group that sponsored these colleges and institutes and academies, and even the theological seminaries were sponsored by synods, which is a middle church court.
Okay, well, let's talk just a moment about church core, because we may be making some assumptions. Mm-hmm. What is the fundamental organization of the Presbyterian Church?
Well, it's defined. Interesting enough, the term Presbyterian is a polity term, so the denomination here in this country is known by its name that represents its government. That's also true, as you know, for Congregationalists and Episcopalians. In other countries, the Presbyterian Church is known as the Reformed tradition or the Reformed Church, and so we hear those two terms. Okay. They're synonymous terms, but Presbyterian refers to a certain form of government, and there are church courts or governing bodies, and they go in ascending order from the session at the local congregation level to the presbytery, which is made up of several different congregations sending representatives and functioning as a court, to a synod, which is made up of several presbyteries, and then to the General Assembly, which is the highest governing body. And so the connectional system is there through these church courts, and the authority is centered in these church courts. So that's where you find the authority always. The presbytery ordains. The presbytery has many powers given to it that are very important for Presbyterian church.
Okay, help me then, because who makes up them? Because I think that's an important characteristic versus other churches.
Representative form of government. John Calvin in Geneva insisted that not only were the clergy to be involved with church government, also the laity. And so he establishes a form of church government that has a parity with clergy and laity, and the laity representative was known for years as a ruling elder. We don't call him that anymore, do we, George? We started calling him just elder. But it was a very important term. Just listen, ruling elder. That's where the Presbyterian Church, again, the authority so often is there in that ruling elder. And that, if you think about Presbyterian churches, congregations, and even presbyteries, or even general assemblies, you'll find that there were laypersons who were ordained ruling elders who were very, very powerful and exercised a lot of authority in the Presbyterian Church. But it's a representative form of government. The group elects certain representatives from among their number and ordain them as ruling elders, and then they meet together in council, and they are the ones as a session or that makes the decisions, most of the decisions within the local congregation. And then from the session you elect representatives to presbytery, and then the presbytery meets with representatives from the various churches along with the ministers of the churches. Okay. And then the synod is ascending church court, and then the General Assembly, where you have commissioners to the General Assembly that are elected from the presbyteries, now not from the local congregations. That's more complicated and involved than probably they want to know, but the representative form of government is the key.
I think that's an important part, and it's a shared responsibility, which I think is very, very key.
George, you may want to speak to that too, your own version of Presbyterian politics.
I don't know if I can really add to that. I think Presbyterians have been concerned about the centralization of power, and since the Reformation, it's been important in the Presbyterian Church that authority be spread out in the church, that the people of the church elect their own representatives who then in turn run the church or have the authority for the church. And then as a pastor, it's my responsibility to influence the ruling body theologically and biblically as to a course of direction to go.
You are braced, if you will, by two persons here, Helen. Let's talk a little bit about you and your background. You and I had a chance to be together when we were at Breckenridge Hospital and in the CPE program, and it seemed to me that there was
something in your background, in your heritage from North Carolina. What is your heritage? Would you share that with us?
I come from a small town in North Carolina, Pembroke. It's 3,300, 3,000, 4,000 individuals. I worked with the Pembroke Area Presbyterian Ministry Program as the administrative assistant before coming to seminary. It was there that I answered the call to come to seminary.
Wonderful.
And after talking with my pastor and my executive presbyter and various other key people in my life, I made the decision to move to Texas and attend Austin Presbyterian Seminary.
That's quite a venture for you, really. You know, when you think about setting up and changing your life to where your whole lifestyle is obviously going to be affected by the goings-on here and your year of sabbatical, I guess it was, in Southwest Texas. Where did you go? Near, where was it? El Paso or something?
Fort Stockton, Texas.
Fort Stockton, okay. And what were you doing that year?
I worked as the student pastor, assisting the pastor in the various areas of ministry. I was involved with worship, youth ministry, ministry with the elderly, institutional ministry, worked with the various committees of the church, hospital visitation, this sort of thing. General ministry.
Okay.
With the pastor.
But she received academic credit for it. See, where it's part of her education, and so she received the same kind of credit she would have had she been in classroom work. And so it's weighted the same and the same sort of norms for education.
I call it sabbatical. That's probably the wrong word. Probably internship or practicum, or what would be more accurate in terms of the description of what was going on there.
And internship.
Okay. Tell me, you have a very unique heritage. Would you share that with us?
I come from the an Indian group called the Lumbee Indians. They're in southeastern part of North Carolina. 35 to 40,000 of them in that particular area. We are not a reservation Indian. We live in communities like any other community.
Okay.
The economic status range from farmer all the way up to doctor, judge.
That's interesting.
Veterinarian.
Before I had met you, I didn't know that they existed. My ignorance, my wife, as you know, is a part Potawatomi, but there are so few Potawatomis left that she, I guess, still has a full head right in the tribe, although she's 132nd or something like that as a percent by blood right. You just returned from a very interesting visit, I understand, and went to the Middle East to experience the places of the gospel and of the New and the Old Testament as far as that goes. What stands out in your mind from that visit?
One of the places that we visited in a place called Marissa, I understand it was a cave where the early Christians, after being persecuted, would go to this cave and worship. On Christmas Day, which was January 6th, we went and visited that cave and sang Christmas songs and carols, and it was a very meaningful experience to be there.
So you went all the way from Fort Stockton to Jerusalem. How did the trip influence your own thinking about Presbyterianism? Anything that strikes you? I haven't had a chance to talk with her about the trip either, so this gives me as the academic.
I'm still reflecting on the trip. There was so much involved in what we did. It was, I kind of felt like I ran where Jesus walked. And I'm still trying to get it all in focus in my mind to start really thinking about it. But I am sure as I continue to study the scripture and teach, preach, counsel, work with people in the various areas, this experience will be very meaningful for me as I share it with others.
Yeah, to me,
the context of Scripture takes on a totally different significance. It's no longer an academic context, but it is a real context. The woman that wanders into the meeting where Jesus had the meal with Simon, and you could begin to feel and see how something like that could have taken place, much more so after having lived that experience, I think, there. Well, that's neat, really. Well, you have a major year, and this is a major year for you, with graduation anticipated in May, all the finals and the special confessions and acts of faith and things like that you go through in that process prior to ordination, and then the call that's issued and that you answer, I guess, someplace across the United States. I guess there's no territorial bounds per se on there, is there? Unless you yourself wish to limit them.
Yes, that's correct.
And so that's kind of a very open thing. How does that call come about? George, you've responded most nearly from that call. The call, I guess what I'd like to do is to talk just a moment about the self-assessment. What does a congregation go through before they get themselves ready to issue a call, to begin the search, to be able to articulate what their needs are and what they see as their direction? How do they come to that understanding?
A Presbyterian congregation does an extensive mission study to understand its own identity, how Jesus Christ has called it into being, how it has functioned in the community where it's located, what kind of witness it has to that particular community, and how it can be most effective in that witness. And it looks at its congregation, the age groups, the kinds of people that make up its membership. And then on that basis, they then begin to picture together the kind of pastor that they think would help to lead them and inform them biblically and theologically about their mission and outreach to the world as well as to the community.
How long might this process take?
I think it varies. A smaller church might be able to go through that process in 6 to 8 months. A larger church, 1 to 2 years.
Okay, so that, let's say that a minister left or for whatever reason, and there was a need to replace, okay, him or her, as the case might be. Now, how do we, this body meets and survives in some way or another on the gospel as preached to them by, what, a visiting a minister at that time?
Again, it depends on the church.
Okay.
The presbytery, which would correspond roughly to a county,
Okay.
at least a California county, a little larger than the Texas counties. For example, our presbytery has 150 churches located within its bounds. The
Okay.
presbytery has oversight over that church, and the presbytery, through its representatives, will meet with that church and help it through its process and make sure that, very sensitively, that they are looking after the needs of that congregation. The presbytery will appoint or assign supply preaching and pastoral work in that church.
Okay.
If it's a larger church and can afford a full-time interim minister, they will allow that congregation to call an interim minister to come, and that interim minister can perform a real service to the church by helping it through a transition period.
To facilitate this process going on.
That's right. And help it to remain open to a new pastor coming in who likely will have different personality and different skills and abilities than the pastor that just left.
Okay.
It's quite a different process than, of course, the Methodist or the Episcopal Church or Roman Catholic Church, you know, any other
It's
Episcopal form
unique.
of government.
And
the call is very critical. You're talking to Helen about her sense of call. And again, in the Presbyterian Church, traditionally, you would not be ordained until you had received a call from a congregation to come and be pastor. Your ordination would await that call. And so some people have gone through seminary and never been ordained because they never received a call.
Okay.
Now, that's not quite as rigid as that. They can be ordained for other forms of ministry other than pastor local congregation. But also the Presbyterian Church, unlike other denominations, one of the first things you learn as a young pastor is the Presbyterian Church does not guarantee you a church. In other words, unless the church calls you, you're without a job, traditionally. So Helen is in the process of presenting her name to different congregations that might be interested in calling her. And if a congregation does call her, then she will have to determine whether or not that call is of God and a call that she will respond to. And so Presbyterians have had a very interesting history with this sense of call. It's very important to the Presbyterian system. So when George talks about going to another church, that church would have technically called him. And then that church will have to go through this study and then issue a call to another Presbyterian.
But I think there's strength in that. There is real strength in that because it produces a two-way commitment in that these people, the congregation understands what they're looking for, and the minister also has an opportunity to understand that instead of going in a blind kind of way.
I had an unusual situation in that on the same day I received 3 calls from 3 different churches.
Oh, really?
Which meant
He's bragging.
No, well, except what I'm leading up to in that is that I actually then had 4 options. One was to stay where I was, which was a very fruitful ministry, and then the other one was to respond to one of the other 3 calls. And what that produced in me was tremendous anxiety, as my wife and I really prayed and wrestled with that. Now, where does God want us to be? And sometimes I think it would have been nice to have a bishop to say, you go there. But instead, as the ones who, the congregations involved had felt like I was one they wanted to call as their pastor, now the responsibility was with my wife and I to ascertain whether God wanted us to move or not. And that was very difficult. And sometimes I wish someone else made that decision for me.
That's fascinating, really, because I really think that there is an awful lot of sensitivity to that, and it's not well understood about that tenuous or that narrow line that one walks trying to understand that call and the call from God, and whether that is really what you're being asked to address. Very, very much so. That's neat. George, in your congregation today, how do you see the Presbyterian image? How do you see the gospel being lived, not only within the congregation as they minister to themselves, but as they reach out beyond that?
It has been important to Presbyterians historically and currently that the gospel be lived out in community and in the society in which the church finds itself. We have what we call creeds, and the creeds are examples of ways in which the church has been confessing its faith in various times. And we feel all of our creeds and our own biblical faith and theology informs us that we should be active and involved in the community. I can speak.
How are you?
Right. I can speak most familiarly about our church, and I think this is representative of other churches in town. We are real active in Manos de Cristo, which is a Presbyterian project in East Austin, which is ministering to a diverse population. We have dentists who are leaving next week, dentists in our congregation who are going to the border to work free of charge on the teeth of people in border towns with our country.
Wonderful.
Puentes de Cristo is the name of that ministry.
Okay.
We are very active in Austin Metropolitan Ministries.
Yes,
and
very definitely.
And volunteers and also finances. We are building homes with Habitat for Humanity here in town. We just finished one. We hope to start a new one shortly.
Those are the things, really, George, to me, that really speak very strongly of what the Presbyterian faith is, because it is lived outside of a building. It is lived in the hearts and the minds of the people as they leave on a Sunday and bring that message into reality, into the community.
into our border towns. And I think that speaks extremely well. As we begin to conclude our session today, I'd really like to take and thank you, Bob, for your taking the time. I know this has been a busy day at the school, at the seminary specifically. Helen, stepping out of your many activities, not only at Brackenridge, but at the seminary and things like that, I appreciate yours taking the time. George, on extremely short notice, you've been exceptional. I thank you for making this a very, very special time. And so as we draw to a close today, please accept my thanks. I'd like to thank you for sharing your time and experiences with our program, with our guests today. The Presbyterian faith tradition has a strong presence in the Austin area. This is my last show as a member of the Austin Faith Dialogue team. It's time to allow others to bring their gifts. And I want to thank you here, particularly the staff at KTBC, for your help and patience, and thank you for the viewing audience for your support. Please tune in to next week's Austin Faith Dialogue. Good day.
For more information about today's topic, call the Austin